There are a lot of different ways to work with procedural terrains within View 6. And let's take a look at one of them right now, which is using a standard terrain, which I'm just going to load in over here on the left. And what we can actually do is model the terrain that we would like with the standard terrain, and then add that extra bit of detail that we need by converting it to a procedural terrain. So let's go ahead and double click on this standard terrain. And that's just going to open up our terrain editor. And I'm going to expand this so it's full view and we can see a little bit better. Now with the standard terrain, we want to make sure that we're working with a good amount of pixels to define the elevation type. So if we look at the top, we can see we can either divide in half or we can multiply. So I'm just going to multiply this twice so that we have 1024 by 1024 pixels, which is the image map that's creating our current terrain. And right now this is just the terrain by default that was created. And if we want to take a look at the actual gradient that is creating our terrain, we can go to Picture, and now we can see our existing terrain, which is our grayscale map, black being the lowest part of our terrain, white being the highest. Now what we can do is modify this however we want. And now I'm just going to use some of the settings on the left. We could click on the mountain. We could do canyon. And let's just stick with that right now. Now if I click OK and we go into our scene and apply that, we're still working with a standard terrain, which means if we zoom in very close, we're going to notice that we don't really have a lot of detail. And that's because we're really only defining this by those set amount of pixels that we made. And it is entirely image-based. But one of the nice things about procedural terrains is we can actually use our standard terrain as a base for a procedural terrain and add an extra bit of detail. So I'm going to double-click on our terrain to bring us back to our terrain editor. And let's convert this to a procedural terrain. I'm going to go up to the upper left where we have our terrain options, click, and select Procedural. Now we're not going to see any change at all, and that's because we don't have an actual function defined. If we go to the right and we click on our Procedural tab, which is going to show us the function under Altitude Production, we don't see anything at all. It's just completely gray. And that's because right now it is still a standard terrain, because there is nothing else defining our extra bit of detail. So I'm going to right mouse click and edit function. And now in the function editor we can see there is nothing applied. So what I want to do is just click on our altitude output node on the bottom, and I'm going to go up to the left and select our fractal node, which is located the fourth button down on the left, just underneath our noise node. I'm just going to click on that, and now we'll add our fractal node. And I'm just going to stick with a simple fractal right now. And for our noise setting, I'm going to change this to Perlin Noise's value gradient. And I also want to adjust our wavelength. Because we were working with a small terrain, and I didn't size it up at all, we're going to have to change our wavelength. So I'm going to type in 0.1 on all of our axes, just to make this a little bit smaller. What I also want to do is go up to the upper right, and we can see we have a function output observer. If I click on that, it's going to give us a preview of what our function looks like. Now keep in mind, this does not factor in the fact that we already had a standard terrain, and then we're using that elevation from that standard terrain to add to what we're creating. And the output observer is a very powerful piece of the function editor because it allows us to just view everything that we're working on before we actually close out and have to go into our terrain editor to see the effects. Now we have a couple of different options for our function output observer. As you can see, we have a fit vertically section. If I click on that right now, it's going to elevate our terrain, and we can see that we have some of our lower parts expanding a little bit further, and our higher parts going up a little bit higher. And what that's going to do is basically fit our function to fit into the size of our terrain. Now, this is not necessarily going to give you an exact representation of what the terrain is going to look like, because right now, if I was to close this out, this is not the sort of effect we would see. And basically, because we're just stretching it to fit in with the view. And we'll explain that a little bit more later, and you'll see sort of a little bit better how that works. Currently, right now, I'm just going to leave that off so we can actually see the function that we're working on. If we take a look underneath our fit vertically, we have a scale option. And this is going to allow us to just adjust the preview of the scale of our function and not actually change the actual size. So I can click on the minus, and that'll bring us down to 0.5, and now we can see twice as much as we were seeing before of our terrain. We can also adjust its origin. So in other words, where it is positioned, and if I change this to, let's say, 20 on the X, we have a movement of 20, whatever your set amount of grid size is. Typically it would be about 20 meters. So I would be moving this texture 20 meters on the X. We could also do negative values as well. I'm just going to leave these at zeros because that's going to give us exactly what we're working with right now. Now we can tell, once I bring that up to 1, that this is quite large still. So what I can do is bring down our wavelength even more if I wanted to. But what I'm actually going to do is just adjust this within our terrain editor, because we can adjust the overall size of our function after we've already created it. And I'm not going to do anything else to this current function. I just want to stick with sort of the default, and we can take a look and see what happens. Now, after it is refreshed, we can see that we still have a lot of the shape of the original detail of our terrain, but along with that function added to the top of it. Now in this case, because of the size of our function, what it's actually doing is overriding a lot of the elevation that we had defined. So we're not seeing a lot of the sharp creases that we had before and the plateaus that we had. So what we can do is scale down our procedural, and I'm just going to bring this down to 0.2, and we're going to let that refresh. And now we can see very high peaks, but this is going to reset itself once it's done. And now we can see we have very high peaks all over, and it really is overriding the entire function. But that's because of our elevation is set a little bit too high. And all we really want to do is just add detail to what we already have. So what we can use is our filter that's located underneath our actual function, and I can just right mouse click and go to Edit Filter. Now our right is going to be the highest part of our elevation, and the left is our lowest. So if I grab our point, which is already created at the end, and drag that down, what it's going to do is bring down our highest point of elevation. Click OK, and we'll let this refresh. Now what we can see is we brought down the entire elevation, including the elevation that we had set before by our standard terrain. So there are other ways of working around this. First thing I'm going to do is just reset our filter. And that's going to bring us back to where we were before, with the very high sections of our peaks. And I'm going to go back into our function editor. And we're just going to edit some of our values so that we're not getting such a dramatic effect, and we just get the little details that we want. One of the first things I want to do is just bring our wavelength down a little bit. And I'm going to change all of these to 0.5, or 0.05 actually. I'm also going to reduce our largest feature, which is going to make basically our largest peaks a little bit smaller than they were. If we take a look at our roughness, it's currently set at 0.5. Now this value is going to give us a lot of differences between our white and black values, and we can see that in our actual preview of our node. So I'm going to decrease our roughness, And now we can see that there's a lot less detail in there. We don't want to go too small because that will actually make our terrain extremely smooth. And what we're actually trying to do is just add those extra bit of details. If we take a look at the gain, I'm going to decrease that. And now we can see that we have a more level surface. Another thing we can also do is adjust the filter within our actual node itself. So I'm going to edit our filter and just bring us down on the right a little to decrease our overall elevation. And click OK. And now as we're refreshing, we can start to see our standard terrain a little bit better, along with that extra detail that we've added. Now I still have my scale set at 0.2, which it doesn't need to be that low now because we edited the actual function. So I'm going to bring that up to a scale of 1, which is our default. And we'll let that refresh. And now we can see our original terrain that we had created as a standard terrain, along with all of the extra details that we were adding on top of this in order to make it a procedural terrain. So let's take a look at this and its render with the extra bit of detail. If we're paying close attention now to our preview render, we can see a lot more detail showing up now at these levels. Where before it was a lot smoother and we had a little bit of pixelation in there, we can now see that we have all these extra bits of details. Although overall it might still be a little too smooth. So we can actually increase that roughness again if we need to. Basically because we've lowered the amount of our gain so much that we actually need to go back in and change that roughness just so that we can see those extra details when we're really close in. Because you can see on the bottom part of our terrain, or where our plateaus kind of curl over and we're looking at sort of the cliff faces, we have a lot of smoothing that we might not want to be there, and we want some more detail. So we'll double click on our terrain to bring us back into that terrain editor. And we're going to go back into our function editor just by making sure we're in our procedural tab still. And we can right mouse click and go to edit function. Click back on our simple fractal, and I'm going to increase our roughness. And I'm also going to increase our gain just a little bit more so that we have a little bit of better detail. And I also want to see some smaller amounts of detail as well. So I'm going to adjust our wavelength once again. And this time I'm going to bring it down to 0.03. And just click OK. And now we can see we have a lot of detail once it's refreshing. But once it's done, it should flatten it out a little bit more. And now we can see by increasing that roughness, and also mainly our gain, we have a lot of bumps all over. So we can smooth that out if we need to, just by going back into the function. Maybe reduce our roughness a little, and also decrease our gain. And you really just want to play around with it until it looks correct. Because of course every single function you're working on is going to be a little bit different, and also depending on the size that you're working on as well. So this should be good right here. We can see we do have some overall flat areas where it is plateaued, but we do have a lot of extra detail, and we can reduce that if we need to. But I'm just going to click OK, and we're going to take a look at our preview render, and now we can see we have a lot of detail in there. And we definitely don't need to worry about losing any detail by being zoomed in. But the only thing is, we're now creating a lot of extra detail that we might not want. So basically, what I might want to do is just reduce our roughness a little bit more, or our gain, and play around with those until I get it to the point where we have the original smoothness of our overall terrain without creating too many bumps, without losing the detail that we had created from our standard terrain. One thing we can also notice is that we do still have a little bit of pixelation on our cliffs. And sometimes that's going to be very hard to avoid when you're using lower pixel resolutions to create your original terrain. if I was to actually want to create a scene like this where I was going to be zooming in very close and taking advantage of that standard shape, but along with the procedural terrain, and let's just take a look at one of these cliffs so we can see that pixelation a little bit more. And we can just see some of these areas and the way they're affected because of that original image map that was created. So one thing you might want to do is increase your pixel resolution a little bit higher before you change it to a procedural terrain if you know you're going to be zooming in very close. If you're going to be staying very far away, because at this distance, it's going to look very good. And let's go ahead and do a render really quick, just to take a look at this from this distance, something a little bit higher. So I'm going to right mouse click on our camera in the upper right to bring up our render options. I'm going to just set this to a final render, set our destination to the screen, and that way it's not rendering in our actual camera view, and we have a separate window that will pop up. And I'm also going to change our resolution so it's just a little bit higher. I'm just going to do 800 by 600 right now, and then we can click render. And if we take a look at the final render now, we can see overall it looks very good. We don't really have any problems with the overall pixelation because of our image-based map underneath our procedural. And basically, a lot of the time, it's really not going to affect you anyway, because once you apply a certain material to your actual terrain, you won't see a lot of that pixelation, mainly because of the bump maps that are included with your actual terrain materials. So let's go ahead and add just a simple material to this right now to actually take a look at this without just the default surface. So I'm just going to load in one of our materials for our procedural terrain. And let's go into landscape. And we're going to select the rock and plants. Now we also want to make sure that our scale is set correctly for this. So I'm just going to decrease this a little to about 0.2. And that's mainly because we're working with an extremely small terrain. This isn't exactly full size. Of course, if we were working with something normally, we want to scale it up a little bit. If we take a look at the actual size of this, we have a 25 meter by 25 meter terrain, and its height is only about 5 meters. So overall, it's not a very large terrain. So we have to work with smaller sizes for our actual materials in order to get this to look correct. Otherwise, we're going to have extremely large materials on this, especially because in this case, we have an image-based material where we really want to set the size first, because once we zoom in, we might see some pixelation. If it's too large, we'll also see some pixelation. I'm just going to adjust our lighting really quick so we can see this a little bit better. Just go up to our atmosphere editor, under atmosphere, atmosphere editor, or you can hit F4. And because this is a darker material, rather than adjusting our diffuse, which we can easily do, and I'll show you that in just a sec, I'm just going to go to our light option, and under light intensity, just make it a little bit brighter. And if we take a look at our preview, we can now see that our overall terrain is a little bit brighter. I'm also going to adjust our light balance a little more towards ambient, which is going to bring out those darker sections where we have shadows. And that way we can see some of the detail in there as well. Now, if we didn't want to actually adjust the light to increase the material's brightness, we can double-click and on our material to open up the material editor and make sure that we're in the advanced material editor. If we're in the basic, you'll see that this top button will say advanced, and you want to click on that. If we go all the way to the effects, at the end, the effects tab, we can see we have the diffuse option. What we can easily do is just increase our diffusion. Currently it's set to 60%. Try and increase this a little bit higher. We're going to notice that the terrain and the material will brighten up. And if we take a look now in our preview render, we'll see that our terrain is a little bit brighter. And the more and the higher we adjust that, the brighter our terrain is going to get. So I'm just going to render this out, and we can take a look at how it looks with the material on. Now if we can take a look, we can see that we really don't have any problematic sections at all now on our terrain, and with the material on, and the bump map that's influencing our overall terrain, we can see it just looks fantastic and looks really good. You might want to adjust maybe the material size a little bit, but in this case I think it looks rather good, and it's definitely a final product for a terrain. So what we could easily do is just maybe add an ecosystem for our flatter elevations. If we can make a really neat looking mountain out of this,